So, what are the impacts mentally and physically to someone who has been sexually assaulted? That is the topic that we're talking about today in this informal discussion. This is Alissa. She is a sexual assault counselor for Victim Services. And again, if you're just joining us today, we're talking about the mental and physical impacts to survivors of sexual assault after the assault has taken place. So I just want to go over some housekeeping items real quick. Just a reminder that anything that you post in the comments is public. The presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our Facebook page after the broadcast if you need to leave. If you have a specific question about you or someone that you know, please call the Victim Services Crisis Hotline at 309-837-5555. That is the most secure and confidential way to discuss the specific situation that you need to get questions answered about. We do welcome general comments, even on the replay of the broadcast, so please feel free to leave general questions in the comments, or you can contact that hotline number I mentioned earlier and you can ask your question directly to a counselor. So let's start a little bit about Alissa. Tell us what you do for Victim Services.
So hi, my name is Alissa. I am a sexual assault counselor here for Victim Services. I mostly see adults. I do counsel some children as well. And then I also work with 2 correctional facilities to help try and provide counseling for persons in custody who are victims of trauma prior to incarceration and since incarceration.
Mm-hmm. And I know this number changes quite a bit, but on average, how many people do you provide services to at one time? Just to illustrate that this is a problem in Western Illinois and there are other survivors out there.
There are. So I have about 30 clients on my caseload. About 15 or so of those I see every week. Mm-hmm. And then I have some that I see once a month, or some of them who are college students who have a counselor at home. I'm kind of a backup. So if they're here at school in Macomb and they need someone to reach out to, then I will see them as needed. So
okay. So then that leads into this very important topic we want to talk about. Obviously, sexual assault is very traumatic and comes with its own mental and physical impacts in the moment.
Yes.
But we're talking about the aftermath of what happens. And I realize this can be a loaded question and it's different for every survivor. So we're speaking in general terms today. If you are a survivor, obviously what you have experienced may be different than what we are talking about. Or you may pick up on some things that we're talking about and say, hey, that's me. So if you do, please call our hotline and stay tuned to the end of the presentation because we'll talk about this in detail. But let's break it up. Let's start with what are the mental impacts to survivors in general after assault?
So survivors in general, there are some typical, and like you said, there are some survivors who may have different emotional impacts. They may not have all of them, they may have some of them. And there are people who may have some that we haven't discussed today. So, immediately afterwards, there's guilt and shame, like we talked about earlier today. Mm-hmm. Embarrassment, which is, if you are the victim, those are not yours to feel. Those belong to the perpetrator, but I do understand how hard that is. Anxiety, depression, loss of self. It's amazing the amount of clients, when I do their intakes and we start talking and talk about what symptoms they're feeling, they'll say they've forgotten who they are, which seems to be a very common one, just completely forgetting, what they enjoyed, what they don't enjoy. So loss of self-esteems tend to suffer. People can feel worthless, and that comes too from the shame and the embarrassment, feeling that they did something wrong, so it adds to that. Anxiety, for some survivors, it may be post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very common or can be common among sexual assault survivors. Nightmares, flashbacks, depression, eating disorders, substance use. We know that sexual assault survivors are 10 times more likely to use or abuse substances. Severe depression, low self-esteem. So there's just a whole bunch of emotional and psychological effects of sexual violence and sexual trauma.
And it's possible too with some of these things you've mentioned, they may not manifest right away.
Very true. They may not manifest right away. There are victims and survivors who think, you know what, I can deal with this on my own. I don't need any help. And there are some people out there that they are able to do that. But for people who are like, I can just bury it down and it'll go away. And later on, they may start noticing some of these symptoms. They may be anxious and they don't know why all of a sudden. They may start having panic attacks. Or they may start having symptoms of PTSD. And not all of it, a lot of that is caused because subconsciously this trauma is still affecting us and we've never dealt with it. So it's going to start showing in other areas of their life. Another long-term effect, there are, well, I guess I'm kind of getting into medical now. Some other long-term effects, especially of sexual assault that people don't get help for, is health problems. Victims will stop seeing gynecologists. They'll stop seeing their dentist because it's very triggering for them. Obesity is common among survivors, especially who've never had help. So those are some long-term physical things that you may see in the future when you don't seek out or get help when you first are assaulted.
Are there any other physical impacts that survivors experience?
Yeah, there can be some definite, some early on. Of course, there's always the risk of injury with a sexual assault. There is the risk of pregnancy. That can happen. There is the risk of sexually transmitted infections. Now, here, when a person is sexually assaulted, they do have the options. They are automatically given prophylaxis to help prevent the most common sexually transmitted infections. So they do receive that right away. Victims can also receive HIV testing free of cost and HIV prophylaxis free of cost. And the same thing at Plan B if a victim wants that is an option. And also physically there can be eating changes, sleep changes, a startle response where maybe you're not someone that doesn't startle easily, but after the sexual assault you feel like you're always on edge because your brain is still in overdrive from the trauma. So you may startle more frequently. You may find that your heart is racing. You're tired all the time. So those are some physical impacts that, yes, you can see right away after a sexual assault.
And of course, children are impacted by sexual assault as well, and they have their own, I'm sure, physical and mental impacts. Can you talk about how those are different for children?
Yes, so they have some of the same, but then, of course, being children, because we are not the same, they do have some definite changes. You may find with a child, now what I'm going to discuss does not mean that this child was sexually assaulted or sexually abused, but these are symptoms that this could have happened. Everybody, I think, is familiar with bedwetting. Yes, there are children who, if they're sexually abused, they may start wetting the bed. You may see that their behaviors and their development regresses. So a child that was fairly independent now won't go out the front door without somebody. Or maybe they won't tie their shoes. Or maybe they forget how to get dressed. Maybe you will see that the child now doesn't want to take a bath. They don't want anybody to see them naked. They don't say they have school activities. Like maybe they're on a summer soccer team and all of a sudden they no longer want to go and they loved it before. Those might be signs. Urinary tract infections can be common, and unfortunately also symptoms of sexually transmitted diseases. Children can have those symptoms as well. And you might find that children become overly compliant, meaning they start trying really, really hard or doing whatever somebody tells them to do. Say they've refused to empty the dishwasher and all of a sudden they want to empty the dishwasher, or it's a constant thing. Chores that they've always fought you on, but now they do them, but they also do them just maybe a little bit more urgently, but just over compliance. And that time you might also see children, like adults, they will have nightmares. They can have flashbacks, but for them it may be more difficult to explain what they're seeing in their flashback or their nightmares. So that's a few of them. You might also see that their self-esteem really starts to suffer. Like maybe they were confident and now they question everything, or they'll say, I can't do anything, or I'm not any good at anything. Maybe their grades all of a sudden start to suffer. So those are some of the things that add on for children that you can see. And they might be fearful of attaching to new people.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had a child that liked everybody and was always talking to everybody, suddenly if they don't do that, it might be something to question, that something has definitely occurred with that child.
So it sounds like parents and caregivers should watch for abrupt changes in behavior.
Abrupt changes in behavior, most definitely.
Okay. Yep. And for an adult, let me back up, I guess. If a teacher or a caregiver of some kind hears some of these things and thinks that a child they know is being abused, obviously that can be a very delicate subject and potentially dangerous as well, depending on the situation. What advice would you give, general advice, would you give to those people?
General advice, we talked about this earlier today in why people don't report. First general advice is believe. I mean, if you see, even if the child hasn't said anything to you, but you start seeing these sudden changes, believe and know that something is going on. Now, if someone is a mandate, if like a teacher, like me as a counselor, are mandated reporters, when we see those things, we're required to report. So we're required to report those to the hotline, to DCFS, to say, hey, you know, there's something going on here, I'm concerned. And it can be difficult talking about safe. How do you approach a parent when maybe you see these behaviors or these changes in one of your students? Because the fear is, well, what if the parent is the one who is abusing this child? And you really don't want to put thoughts in a child's head, so you don't necessarily want to go up to the child and say, hey, you know, did this happen? Because you don't want to put thoughts in their head. But talk to the child, you know, talk to the child, and they're probably not going to tell you what is going on, but you know your students. You know your school students, you know your Sunday school students, you know your activity students, you know, and ask them if there's something going on. They may not tell you, but at least they know you care. But yeah, if you're a mandated reporter, make that report. Make that report to
DCFS?
To DCFS, to the hotline.
Okay.
Make that report, yes.
Okay. All right. And then for, on the flip side of things, let's say it's an adult, and it's one that I'm either minorly acquainted with or even a family member. Obviously it's a very different situation. Would you suggest the same steps, or how would they be different?
How would they be different? An adult, like a child in one way, if you ask them if they've been abused, sexually assaulted, they may tell you no. Because adults and children as well, because of the shame and the stigma attached, even though, like I said, it's not theirs to bear, they may try to keep that a secret. So if you notice there's something going on, a friend, and they have not told you, or an acquaintance, number one is just supportive. And sometimes that supportive is just listening to what they have to say. Offer to them, you know, if there's something going on, there's help out there for you, regardless of what the situation is. There's help that is available. And if they do disclose, same thing, start by believing, and then provide them the resources. But you know, you can say things like, I noticed you've been down lately. Are you okay? Don't box them into a corner. You know, don't be specific. Are you okay? Is there something I can do to help you? Is there something you want to talk about? But yeah, it would be the best way.
All right. And of course, if you have, if these are bringing up some concerns of yours, or if in the future you run into a situation where you do think a child or an adult is being abused and you just have questions on how to proceed, you're welcome to call the Victim Services Crisis Hotline. It's 309-837-5555. That number's open 24/7, and it will put you in direct touch with a counselor or advocate such as Alissa.
And if I just would like to add some long-term effects that people may not realize. I talked briefly about how sometimes victims will stop going to the doctor.
Yeah.
Another thing that you might see is someone who's had a long history of sexual abuse or sexual assault, and they've never seen help. Some other things that you might see, especially when you're in the medical profession, you might see gynecological complaints if it's a female. Pain that can't be diagnosed, inability to be sexually active, and they want to be. And another one, they may not have prenatal care. So if someone becomes pregnant, even later, and it's a wanted pregnancy, they may not seek prenatal care because of what has happened. And they also might have some gastrointestinal issues as well. So there are some long-term effects for adults as well. And you might see in teenagers and adolescents, which I didn't have this earlier, you might see self-harm, so cutting. And a lot of people, cutting is because it's easier, and this isn't the only reason for it, it's easier for survivors sometimes to feel the physical pain because it numbs the emotional pain. So you may see self-injury, whether that's picking or cutting. And a sign of that is if it's 90 degrees outside and they're wearing long sleeve shirts, or they're wearing jeans instead of shorts, there may be a possibility of some cutting, and you do see that more in adolescents and young adults than you would in older adults. So those are some things I just kind of wanted to add to that.
Yeah, thank you for adding those.
You're welcome.
And the term triggered seems to be being used more nowadays. Sometimes it's used appropriately, and other times I feel it's used in an almost disparaging way, or like it's something to be ashamed of.
Right.
But it's a real thing. It's a modern term for a real thing. Can you talk more about what does it mean?
So yeah, triggering is a very real thing, and I will add there are some in society that are using the word trigger now for things that it really wasn't meant for. And you're right, it does take the importance off of the word trigger for a trauma survivor because it is a very important thing. So a trigger is when somebody has an emotional reaction to a trauma that happened in the past. So what happens with a trigger is when we face trauma, our brain does some different things. And certain parts of our brain get activated that aren't normally, our fear centers can get activated. And it kind of stays activated. It doesn't necessarily completely go away. So a trigger is anything that makes your brain think or reminds you, and it takes you back to that trauma. So a trigger can be a word, it can be a scent, it can be a perfume, it can be a voice that is not the perpetrator's voice, but it's a voice that sounds similar. It can be a place, it can be a time of day. So it's anything that takes you back to that moment of that trauma. One of the early trigger that people will say if they were sexually assaulted at home, say in their bedroom, their bed may be a trigger. Their bedding may be a trigger because it takes them back to that moment. That's a trigger that's, getting rid of the sheets, getting new sheets sometimes help. But other triggers, it's a noise. It is any of those things. For one client of mine, it was a political sign. It was a political sign when they would see driving down the road. And for them, because of what the name that was on the sign, took them back to their abuse. So it's anything that takes someone back to that trauma is what a trigger is. And it makes them feel as if they're feeling the trauma again. So their heart will start racing, they'll panic, have anxiety, or pure fear because it's reminding their brain of what happened.
So I think this probably happens to more people than people realize. And I know you can't give specific advice, but if someone is feeling triggered by something, what general advice would you give them to stay calm?
So we talk about a lot for triggers, our grounding techniques. Sometimes we'll use mindfulness. Grounding techniques seem to work a little bit better in the moment. So what a grounding technique is, it's something that brings you back to the moment, to where you are at that time, and it helps you to remember where you are. One of them we use is called the 5 senses, where in the 5 senses, what are 5 things that you can see? What are 4 things that you can feel? What are 3 things that you can hear? What are 2 things that you can smell? What is 1 thing that you can taste? By doing something like that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in that direct order, but it's your 5 senses, and it brings you back to where you are. It reminds you, I'm at home, I'm sitting on the couch. I'm safe. There's nobody else here.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fairly quick and easy one. Another one that you can do is hold ice cubes. Because those ice cubes, you hold that in your hand and it kind of shocks your system back. It reminds you of where you are.
Mm-hmm.
So ice cubes, the five senses. For some people, maybe it's sucking on hard candy. But hard candy that's of citrus. So like an orange or a lemon or a lime,
Mm-hmm.
sucking on that hard candy, anything that kind of brings you back to where you are in the moment. And there are several other grounding techniques, but those are some of the easiest ones that you can start with. Five senses, we start with that one a lot.
Yep.
Just to remind you, and that's what grounding is, just brings you back to where you are to help you know that you are safe, that you know where you are, you know what time it is, and it can help to slow that down a bit in the moment.
All right. And if someone is feeling triggered, I think when we mention the crisis hotline, some people think that there must be a very critical moment.
Right.
But people are welcome to call the hotline if you're feeling triggered and you want a counselor
Yes.
to walk you through the grounding technique.
Right.
Is that right?
That is true. And we get a lot of, quite a few of our hotline calls is they've seen something, they've heard something, maybe there was something on the news, maybe whatever it is. So yes, call the hotline and we can definitely help you through that. Do some crisis intervention, help with some grounding techniques over the phone, and if need be, maybe get you back in touch with a counselor the next day. But yes, we can help with that at the moment. It does not have to be that you were just assaulted, but it can be a trigger as well.
Okay. And thank you for that information. What services, can you go over what services Victim Services provides to sexual assault survivors?
So on our sexual assault side of Victim Services, we do counseling for victims, whether it's an adult, child, all genders, all orientations, all identities. So we provide counseling for any person who's been sexually assaulted or sexually abused. We also do significant other counseling, and what that means is a mother, a father, a spouse, a significant other, they feel effects of that trauma too. They also feel the loss. They feel guilt. We see this a lot with parents of young children, is they feel terrible guilt. It's like, I didn't protect my child. So they can suffer with guilt and blame and other trauma experiences. So we do counseling for significant others as well. We also do legal medical advocacy, whether that's going with a client to the hospital to have their medical forensic exam, providing emotional support in court or when speaking with law enforcement, and then also helping clients to get civil no contact orders. What a civil no contact order is similar. When we think of orders of protection, we think of emergency orders of protection, which are used in domestic violence. In sexual assault, we use a civil no contact order, which is very similar, but those are for sexual assault victims that this perpetrator, it's the same thing, cannot come near you, cannot contact you, no third-party communication. So we help clients with those orders as well. And then we also can assist with no stalking contact orders as well.
Okay.
And then we do public education, professional training to teach our communities about sexual abuse and sexual assault.
Okay, great. And all those services are free to anybody, no matter what, correct?
All of our services are completely free, and at no cost. And confidential as well. We talked about earlier today, we cannot, as a counselor, we cannot tell anybody anything. If the victim comes to us, we can't tell law enforcement, we can't tell the judicial system, we can't tell family. So it's a safe space where, we can say nothing. So your privacy and confidentiality is maintained as well.
And because it can take a long time sometimes for people to come forward, it does not matter how long the abuse,
Correct.
How long ago it happened.
Correct.
They can call.
You can call at any time. It could have happened when someone was a small child, an adult. It does not have to be an acute sexual assault. It can be at any time in your past. And it can, it's any form of sexual violence. So that includes sexual assault, sexual abuse. That also includes sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is sexual violence, and it's trauma as well. So And some people don't keep that in mind about
Yeah.
that sexual harassment can have some of the same effects on victims.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's an important thing to bring up
Mhm.
because I think you're very correct that it's
Yeah.
seen as like a lesser.
It is,
But
and it's
trauma is
not.
trauma.
Right.
Okay. All right. That brings us to the conclusion of this video. In case you are watching this on a replay, Alissa and I recorded a video earlier. It was about why sexual assault survivors, many of them do not report. And so kind of part of this presentation bled into that one. We talked a little bit about some similar things, but that is a very important topic as
Yes.
well. Something that's definitely important for everyone to be aware of, especially those who want to support survivors. And we've talked about a lot today. So if someone is taking away one thing from this presentation, what would it be?
But there is help. You are not alone, and there is help. There's no judgment. There's no blame. We are here. We are here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You do not have to go through this alone.
All right. And again, the Victim Services, the sexual assault program, I don't think we mentioned this, but the service area is in a 6-county area. It covers Hancock, Henderson, McDonough, Warren, Fulton, and Knox counties in Illinois. And you can call the crisis hotline at any moment. It's 309-837-5555. Keep that number in mind for the future as well. You never know if someone may disclose to you. And of course, start by believing that person if they do and refer them to that hotline. And we've got trained counselors that are ready and willing to help survivors of all ages. And of course, if you are in immediate danger, call local law enforcement. But otherwise, Victim Services counselors and advocates are here to help you. If you liked this presentation, it would really help us out if you could just like the video, or you can leave some feedback with a comment. If you have any general questions, you're welcome to leave a comment as well. If you do that in the future, just tag our page when you leave the comment and we'll answer that question for you. Of course, you're welcome to call the hotline as well and ask your question directly to a member of the Victim Services staff if you'd rather go that route. So hopefully we can do some more videos like this in the future. Thank you so much for the information that you've given us today. Absolutely. So make sure to like our social media pages as well if you haven't already. We're posting all the time about ways that you can support survivors and just information about our services and programs and presentations like this one. So thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.